How many of you get really, really excited by computer servers? I don't think you're telling the truth. A few of you maybe from the computer science department, but the rest of you, I don't know. Usually it's crickets. Nobody ever raises their hand when I ask that question, and that's, as you might imagine, kind of predictable. But it's okay because I do get excited by computer servers, particularly when they're organized in architectures called cloud infrastructures or so-called cloud computing. And the goal of my talk today is, I hope, to get even more of you a little bit excited about cloud computing servers, and even more than that, to get you to think seriously about how you can use those and the potential that they represent, and maybe even one step more than that, how you might even have an obligation or a responsibility to think about that. And that's what I call the cloud imperative. Now, it's a little bit like that old biblical statement, from those to whom much has been given, much shall be asked. And you'll have to forgive me because the fact that I went to divinity school for a year is showing now. I'm actually a divinity school dropout who went on to found a cloud computing company. It's called RightScale. So forgive me for that. But I do truly believe that cloud computing is changing our world for the better, and it's touching all of our lives. Let me throw out a few examples. First of all, think about what NASA and JPL is doing lately with the Mars rover missions, the Cassini probe, sending back images of other worlds to us that are then processed in cloud computing and delivered out over the public web for all of us to see. Or in the field of bioscience, everything from gene sequencing to drug discovery, computed on massive compute grids in the cloud. Think about the social realm. Previous speaker, Matthew Huxtable, talked about the fact that the Arab Spring, that whole uprising was sparked in large part by Facebook and Twitter, services run on cloud computing architectures. Or even in the area of fun and entertainment, everything from the music that we listen to and share to famous movies. For example, remember that Frodo and the Fellowship were able to save Middle-earth in stunning high def, thanks to video rendering completed in clouds. But before I go any further, let's do a little level set. I have another question for you. How many of you feel like you have a pretty reasonable grasp on what cloud computing is and how it works? Okay, that's most of you. The reason I ask is that a recent survey showed that 1 out of 5 Americans has pretended to know what cloud computing is. I don't think that applies to this audience at all. But, further detail, 14% have pretended in a job interview, and 17% of us have pretended to know what cloud computing is on a first date. You try to imagine that scenario. It's a little, hey, baby, I know what cloud computing is. So anyway, as a little brush up for all of us, and for those of you who are heading to a second date and don't want to blow it, here's a little background. The phrase cloud computing comes originally from these diagrams in the mid-1990s that were used by engineers up on whiteboards about connecting different data centers, branch offices, workstations, etc., through the internet. And the cloud on this diagram simply represented that you didn't know or care the pathway that the connection took, whether it went through Las Vegas or Chicago or Dallas. You didn't know, you didn't care. As long as the packets in the communication arrived, they were reliably and with reasonable performance. But this concept is, in fact, in simple terms, what cloud computing is about. Same idea, the computing takes place somewhere else. You don't know quite where, and you don't care about that. But this concept is really a generation old by now. So what's new today? Well, about 6 years ago, there was an innovation. It was around the notion of exposing infrastructure, which is a fancy name for computer servers and storage and so on, in new ways. The first part about it was that it was automated. And that means that software programs could talk to other software programs and have them do stuff. like launch a server, terminate a server, things like that. Second big point had nothing to do with technology. It was around the business model. And it was the notion that you could pay as you go for using these resources. Pay by the hour, in fact. And one of the interesting corollaries about that was that it cost the same thing to run one server for 1,000 hours as it cost to run 1,000 servers for 1 hour. And that kind of turned upside down the notion of applying computer power to solving problems. The final point was around the fact that the early cloud service providers did all this and created the illusion that these resources were infinite. And so designers and users of these compute resources didn't really need to plan around scarcity at all. In fact, they could always plan around the notion that there were no constraints. There would always be another computer server available if they needed to use it. And these were really, I would say, revolutionary changes in the way this service was delivered. So going back to how did I get involved? Well, about 5.5 years ago, a half year into this new process, I had a friend of mine and a colleague, Torsten von Eichen, who's really the guy who originally got the idea for RightScale started. He called me and said, hey, I've written a web interface that lives on top of this new cloud computing service called Amazon EC2. Would you check it out? And I went home that evening and fired up my laptop and logged in, created an account, and launched a server. It was, as I recall, a WordPress server, which, as some of you might know, is a piece of blogging software, open source blogging. And about 5 minutes later, it was running. And this was a huge aha moment for me. It was revolutionary to me. I thought, my God, this is so easy. It's so inexpensive. It's going to change the way information technology is delivered and consumed. Because I had been through the old way of buying servers, taking 4 weeks for them to ship, racking and stacking, all that stuff. And in fact, 5.5 years later, our company has now launched nearly 5 million servers on behalf of customers. And you know, that's an interesting number. I think it's nice, it's kind of cool. But more important is what stands behind that. And that is the companies and the solutions that were created on this infrastructure. And if you take a glance over this limited set of companies we've worked with, you can see it ranges from small startups you've probably never heard of to the biggest multinational companies. All of them, however, having one thing in common, which is running from a kind of a startup agile mentality, whether it's a startup company or a startup project within a larger company. And I'd like to call out 2 examples, just to give you a sense, nitty-gritty examples of the kinds of projects being done that perhaps aren't as grandiose as the Mars rover and things like that, but are closer to my heart in terms of helping all of us identify with what can be accomplished. The first one is Animoto. They were actually our very first customer, and it was 5 guys with some experience in the television industry who said, we want to make a service that allows people to take their digital photos and convert them into cool-looking videos. And what they do is they create transition and animation effects that match the music that you choose to go with the videos. And they started out, they built their service on top of RightScale in the cloud. And what happened about a year later, they got a cool idea, which is let's create a plugin for Facebook that lets Facebook users do this. And this graph shows what happens. Essentially what they did is let a user take their Facebook photos, make a video, email it to their Facebook friends who could then take their Facebook photos, make a video, email it to their Facebook friends. What you can see there is the heart of a viral scenario, right? This was a viral experience. And the graph on the bottom of the display is how many servers they were running over a couple-week period. They were running along at about 50 or 60 servers, and over 3.5 days, they launched 3,500 servers around this Facebook plugin. They were signing up about 20 or 30,000 new users per hour at the peak. And what's interesting about this story and compelling to me is, again, not the technology of automation, but the fact that a business could not have done this. They couldn't have done this without cloud computing. They wouldn't have been able to raise the money, and logistically, they wouldn't have been able to rack and stack and configure all of those servers to accomplish this. The next example is even closer to home. It's actually a local company here in San Luis Obispo called Edgify. And it was founded by Andrew DeMille, who's a former colleague of mine and a friend, and his buddy Spencer and some others. In fact, I think they might be in the audience. Can you guys raise your hands there? Edgify is a very cool service. It's a brand new startup. And what they do is they assist with coaches working with athletes, and they make that process a lot richer and more productive. It not only includes kind of a way for them to communicate back and forth in a typical kind of social forum nature, and to communicate over times when they're not working together in person, but it allows for the posting of photos and videos, and most importantly, to track progress over time. And I think this is another example of making our lives better, because if you think about it, it encourages activity, it encourages exercise, and it encourages us to follow a process of thinking about how we progress and improve at something that we're working on. And all of that is goodness. All of the companies that have been very successful at using cloud, in my experience over the last 5 years, have shared a particular kind of approach in common. It's an approach that I call the experimental approach. And that doesn't mean they're going into a lab and doing a science experiment. What it does mean is that they have a particular mental attitude, a kind of a cultural work orientation of building the first iteration of a particular solution, and then getting it out there, learning from it, and iteratively improving it. And I love this image of the history of the evolution of the wheel in human society, because to me it embraces that same idea of taking a concept that you get out there and learning from your experience with using it, and then improving it over time based on what you've learned from the past and based on the current resources and materials that you have available. And I think that this particular approach meshes especially well with the fact that cloud computing provides resources in such an agile manner for all of us to take advantage of at cost that is really quite affordable and achievable for most of us. I think you're all familiar with this guy. This, of course, is Master Yoda from Star Wars. And I had to put his image up today because he, like me, believed that small teams can achieve amazing things in this world. And I think, in fact, he believed further in something called the Force that was helping them. You may or may not believe in the Force, but I'm here to tell you that there is a force behind cloud computing that we can all leverage now, that is available to us in a way that it wasn't even 10 years ago. Master Yoda was famous for saying, "Do or do not, there is no try," if you remember. And it was kind of a bold statement of confidence and believing in what you're doing. I would amend that a little bit to say, try and try again and try again and keep trying until you can finally do it. And to me, that's in the very same spirit, but a lot more in keeping with this kind of experimental approach that I've spoken of. So, to conclude, I'd like to leave you with one last question. What could you do with 1,000 servers, or with 10,000 servers, or with 100,000 servers? And it might seem like a bit of a silly question. Maybe you're not a technologist or a software person, and maybe you're not a geek like me who gets excited about computer servers, although I've never had as many people raise their hands as you did. So maybe those things don't apply. But I hope you do take seriously that these resources are available. You can certainly find people who know how to do the technical part. It's really more a question of what aspirational, creative, new idea do you have that you can go pursue and actualize? And so I'd leave you with that question, and I hope you take it to heart even as more than just an opportunity or a potential, but almost as a responsibility and an obligation that we all have to use these incredible resources in one way or another, I hope to make the world a little bit of a better place. Thank you very much.